Right. Good morning to all of you. And this is the first and introductory class for the Pope's poem, Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Now, what I'll do today is to give you a context in which Arbuthnot was written, talk about the brief structure of the Horatian Epistle as such, and talk about what Arbuthnot fundamentally meant in the canon of Pope, and why Pope had to write such a satire. Now, you will understand that these moral epistles and satires that Pope wrote were written at almost the end of his poetic career. In fact, his major works had all been published by this time, including The Rape of the Lock, which was one of the earlier poems of Pope. You have the Essay on Man, which is published around 1725, Dunciad, published shortly after. And the epistles were all written between 1730, 34, 35, published actually in 35. So Pope was writing these at the end of his career, as it were. Now, before I move on to these epistles, really, because Pope calls them Horatian epistles, it is important to understand what and why Pope was using them from Horace. Now, Horace also writes these essays or these epistles in the form of letters. That's what the epistle is, a letter. But in reality, these are all reflective pieces of poetry. And what Horace's epistles reveal is a feeling of banter, an exchange, and a certain tone of moderation. A certain tone of moderation. Obviously, you will, if you have followed the lectures on the origin and progress of satire, see Dryden divides satire into predominantly the Horatian and the Juvenalian forms. And the Horatian form is marked by a degree of moderation. In fact, moderation is an important word that will come in back and forth in the Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Right. Now, Horace wrote a total of approximately 23 epistles, of which, the ars poetica, or the art of poetry, is considered to be a part. Now, therefore, the epistle also contained Horace's poetic manifesto, as it were, ars poetica being the manual of poetry almost for Horatian scholars. And Pope, of course, is borrowing a lot of these ideas from Horace. Now, Horace, in book 1 of these epistles, talks about 20 epistles. And in these epistles, he talks about his meditative life, his almost retired meditative life. And he talks about his own status as the preeminent poet of the period. He was talking about his status as one of the most important literary figures of the age. And he was therefore moving towards the persona of the moralist and painter of life, as it were, a very subtle painter of character. And very importantly, he was talking about certain ethical and sort of literary skills and value systems. So his epistles contain the importance of philosophy, for example. He talks about the literary poet. He talks about the independence of spirit. He talks about the advantages of country life. He talks about contentment. He talks about a request, happiness upon virtue, on true independence. So independent spirit becomes an important aspect of the poetic persona. Also, he talks about literary correctness, and he talks about his relationship with his critics, and the ability to tolerate criticism and respond to it. And he also talks in book 2 of the epistles, which fundamentally have 3 epistles. He talks about popular taste and judgment. He talks about the art of poetry. Now, I'll just briefly linger on this aspect of what Pope considers to be the art of poetry and what his fundamental thesis is. He talks about poetry as fundamentally drawing upon virtue and delight, right? And where virtue is predominant over the concept of delight. We've talked about this utile and dulce, utile predominating over dulce. But he talks about also the structure of the poem, which should be about unity and simplicity. He talks about the poet as guarding against all extremes. He talks about the use of a more conservative language, coining words only and only if it is absolutely necessary. He talks about, very importantly, redrafting and drafting the poem. So his very sage advice is keep a piece 9 years, an advice that Pope will be dispensing in the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. He talks about the characters that are to be observed in each age. He talks about the satiric drama, the music on the stage. And the most important thing that Horace is talking about is that it is not merely genius that marks poetry, it is also following the rules of poetry, right? And obviously that caveat that the poet's role is to give instruction and delight. And he also talks about a short comparison between poetry and learning. And he talks about the role of patronage in poetry, something which Pope will also talk about, and how a poet should be aware of flattery and false patronage. Now, why do I talk at length about these Horatian epistles? Because when Pope is writing these epistles, obviously, Horace is the precursor, as it were. And therefore, the question rises as to why Pope chose these epistles as the form in which he would write his poems. Now, it is also interesting to take a quick look at what Pope was writing in these epistles, really. And that is a major feature here. Now, Pope actually talks about more or less 5 epistles. He talks about the epistle to Cobham. This is 1734, which is addressed to Sir Richard Temple. And this is titled of the knowledge of and characters of men, right? So this is fundamentally an epistle about human nature and character. And character portrayal is very important in terms of these epistles. The second epistle is titled Epistle to a Lady, and it's directed towards Martha Blount, and it talks about the character of women, where Pope unfortunately turns out to be an extreme misogynist. He has lines like most women have no character at all, and he talks about women as being paradoxes and very difficult to fathom. He also has this epistle to Bathurst, which is Alan, Lord of Bathurst, and this is on the use of riches. There's also this epistle to Burlington addressed to Richard Boyle, the Earl of Burlington, and this is also about the use of riches. And you, of course, have this particular episode as a kind of preface to the epistles of Pope, as it were. And this is the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. I'll come to Arbuthnot in a moment. But if you look at these epistles, if you look at Cobham, if you look at Martha Blount, if we look at Lord Bathurst, and we look at Earl of Burlington, what we observe is a poet who is concerned now with more general philosophical issues like the character of men, like the use of riches. So Pope is quickly falling back upon the Horatian mode of the epistle, which is about general philosophy and the characteristics of men. But having said that, Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot is slightly different in the sense that here Pope is constructing very, very craftily a kind of an literary autobiography. He's talking about himself, his impulse of writing. And here you have to understand the context in which this poem was written. Now, Arbuthnot, of course, was part and parcel of the Scriblerus Club, right? One of the most important men of letters, physician. He was a doctor. He was, in fact, also the physician to Queen Anne, right? So he was one of the most preeminent medical personalities of the period. Arbuthnot was a member of the Scriblerus Club, to which Pope, Gay, Swift all belonged. Therefore, he was also part and parcel of the literary scenario and was an important critic of Pope's poetry. He's also a close friend of Pope. And therefore, in 1734, Arbuthnot wrote to Pope saying that he was dying. He was in a terminal illness. The Pope had already crafted a few parts of his poem earlier, right? So he decided to bring this epistle into being as a kind of a tribute to Dr. Arbuthnot, right? So Pope was therefore, these random pieces which he had written earlier, he was bringing them into a cohesive form so that it could act as a kind of a tribute to Arbuthnot. But very importantly, you need to understand that this poem is not about Arbuthnot at all. This poem is about his poetic self-fashion. Now, you will, of course, remember that Pope had numerous critics. He was afflicted by severe diseases. He was only 4.5 feet tall. And in fact, in this poem, he writes about this long disease, my life. Therefore, Pope was diseased. He was some kind of a dandy, always feeling that he was extremely rakish, but it turned out to be, his affairs with women turned out to be extremely, let us put it this way, not very successful at all. Now, also because he belonged to this Catholic group and he belonged to this Scriblerus Club, he had his numerous detractors, of which, of course, Lord Harvey and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu were two very, powerful critics who had attacked Pope. And Lord Harvey, in fact, had attacked Pope for his base birth, very ordinary birth. And Lady Mary Wortley Montagu had also talked about Pope's failing poetry. Apart from this, of course, there were literary rivalries of the period. Pope was writing at a time when Joseph Addison was one of the most important literary figures of the period, written his classical tragedy Cato. And you will remember that Pope had gone to Addison to find out whether to keep the Silts in the Rape of the Lock. Addison had advised against it, and Pope had gone against his wishes and kept the sylphs in the poem. And therefore, Pope considered Addison to be a literary rival, not a literary rival really, but somebody, a literary figure who overshadowed the situation or the circumstances, but who was not very generous, who did not want to help other poets. Therefore, these poetomachias, or these tensions within contemporary literary scenarios, also made its way into Arbuthnot. Apart from this, of course, was the phenomenon of Grub Street, which we have talked at length in our lectures on Mac Flecknoe. If those of you who are new to this class will please go to the lectures on Mac Flecknoe, which I've already uploaded, and which talk at length about Grub Street. Just to give you a very brief history, at this point of time, there was an explosion of print culture. And due to this explosion of print culture, because of cheap printing, around the fringes of London, near Moorsgate and the suburbs of London, there arose a kind of a seedy locality where printers, cheap printers, hack writers, prostitutes, gambling dens thrived. Now, this area was fictionally known as Grub Street, and it was the home of hack writers, home of cheap printers, and therefore there was a very rapid conflict between high culture and low culture, with Grub Street emerging as the place for low culture. And because print was suddenly very cheap and pretty, pretty attractive as a profession, people sort of started publishing. Therefore, there was this image in contemporary London about the spider and the bee, with Grub Street representing the spider, people who produced copiously literature, treatises, plays, whatever, and could print them very easily, versus the bee, which was classical, literary, high quality, high culture stuff, right? So these are two images which you will find, of course, in this particular poem. The third thing about the literary scenario that I need to talk about is also the system of patronage. Now, you see, at this point of time, literature was not a profession as such. You could write for a living, but it was not a very good living at all. And therefore, people had to survive on patrons and patronage. And very often, a literary text would be deemed successful or would be attractive only and only if an established writer sort of wrote the preface. So there are two things here. One is literary patronage, and patrons came in all shapes and sizes. And you will find that here, there's this figure of Buffo, who is a patron who only sort of recommends texts whose authors sort of flatter him. So he does not care about quality, he cares about flattery. And there was this extreme reluctance of a large number of poets of the period who saw this system of patronage as willy-nilly killing off their literary skills. Also, very importantly, Pope suggests that because he was the preeminent poet of the period, everybody rushed to him to write prefaces. So his house at Twickenham was therefore frequented by budding writers of Grub Street who want to publish whatever they have written, and therefore they ask for subscriptions for him. So along with patronage, there was also the system of literary subscription. So what you did was, because printing was still slightly expensive, what you did was you asked for subscriptions. So supposing I write a book and I see that, X number of people pay £10 to me, and then my cost of printing the books is covered. So I ask for subscriptions, and if you have subscribed, I send a copy of the book to you, right? So you have to understand very clearly that the system of printing or print culture was fundamentally different from what we have right now, right? So Pope was commenting in Arbuthnot on this entire scenario of print culture, right? So firstly, he's talking about the interrelationship between him and Arbuthnot. He's also talking about his own parentage. He's talking about the print culture of the period. And Arbuthnot actually became important for Pope because Arbuthnot had warned him not to name his detractors and not to criticize very sharply. Therefore, Pope was taking on a tone of moderation here, moderation and illusion, whereby he would not directly rail against his critics, but he would obliquely formulate a strategy of satire. This will also go into the discussion of the poem that we will make. Now, the other thing that we also need to understand is how Pope presents his own self. Now, if you look at this poem, as I said, is in the form of a dialogue. But the poetic voice is the one which has almost 98% of the speeches, right? And there are occasionally only very dramatic interventions by Arbuthnot. Very few of them, in fact. Therefore, Pope's poem is about Pope. Let's come to that very clearly. And Pope is, in a certain way, fashioning his own poetic self. What do I mean by this? What do I mean by this concept of fashioning his own self? Now, you see, when a poet writes satire, he has to justify himself. Why has he written what he has written? Right? Therefore, Pope goes into this midway through the poem, he goes into why he has written poetry. That's my first point. In fact, if you read Arbuthnot, you will find that the first point that Pope makes is that why did he write poetry? And he says that he wrote poetry because it came to him, because he was blessed with this genius, because his vocation as a poet was determined from his birth. And that the critics of that period, including Denis and the others, the preeminent literary figures of the period, recognized his greatness, recognized his abilities, and therefore encouraged him to write. So Pope is suggesting that he's born a genius and born to be a poet, and that he wrote not because he wanted to write poetry, but because poetry was natural to his spirit and that he was recognized very quickly. This is point number one. Point number two is where Pope sort of presents this image of his house being bombarded by budding writers, people asking for prefaces, people asking for recommendations. So Pope is carving himself in a Horace-like figure, you see, a Horatian figure who is the preeminent poet of the period and therefore immensely in demand, right? But you will find that in this entire text, Pope is going to create himself as a surrogate figure of Horace, a surrogate figure of Horace. And how he's going to do that is very interesting. But what Pope is suggesting, therefore, is by creating this element of him bombarded by critics, is that he is the dominant literary figure of the period. Right? So he's sort of creating this image of the self as the poet of the period, the poet who is preeminent in taste, who is the great moral champion of the period, and therefore who is the determiner of both literary and moral merit within society. So Pope is, as it were, crafting for himself a larger than life image, who is, exasperated by the attention that he's getting. Right. So here's a dichotomy. In fact, when I talk about Arbuthnot, I'll talk about this dichotomy. Pope, as it were, renounces attention, yet it is attention that he seeks. Pope is, as it were, praising people, but he's also critiquing people. Right. So there are many, I will say, contradictions within this text. But the most important fact remains that Pope is wanting to create a self-projection of himself as the preeminent author of the period. So one is, why did I write? Secondly, I have become the most important figure of the period. And thirdly, then he talks about two things. Who are these people who are flocking to him? So these are poor scribblers, and through them he attacks his detractors, and this spreads out. You see, he spreads it out from people who are fools yet who praise him, so he does not want that praise, but these fools actually praise him in the way that he's almost like Alexander, he's almost like Horace. So there's also, again, very craftily the creation of an image that he's a superhuman poet or a poet of excellence. And then there is this critique against the people who have attacked him, right? So who are the people he attacks? He attacks, of course, Addison as Atticus. He attacks Lord Harvey as Porus. He attacks Lady Mary Wortley Montagu as Sappho, and he attacks the Duke of Birmingham as Buffo, right? Therefore, these are the four figures whom he attacks. He also attacks Colley Cibber, for example, and there are numerous figures whom he, in fact, this poem is littered with, minor poets whom Pope attacks, figures like Lintot, who were his publisher. So numerous literary allusions. Now, I'm not really concerned about all those literary allusions. This is a 419 line long poem, so I will probably not be able to cover every line in great detail. But he is, as it were, sort of criticizing through Atticus, through Buffo, systems of literary patronage, systems of forming circles of poets, systems of false attacks, systems of personal spite. And therefore, another theme that enters the poems or enters the poetry here is the theme of who is a good poet, right? And whether a good poet is one who is a good man, right? So the linkage between the morality of the poet and the quality of the poetry is another very important thing that we must talk about. Equally, we must talk about how, literary cliques or groups are formed, and how Atticus is at the center of this, how false patrons can create bad poetry, figure of Buffo, how bad individuals or how evil individuals like Sporus, can manufacture very spiteful poetry. And of course, Sappho is how, one who is beautiful necessarily need not be beautiful as an individual. And then comes the last section of the poem, where Pope will talk about his parents. In fact, he will compare himself with Horace once again. Horace had very ordinary parents, so Pope will suggest that his parents also came from ordinary stock. And then again, therefore, you see, Pope is trying to project himself as this Horatian figure of the age. And finally, in the last stanza, he will wish Arbuthnot the very best, as it were, and he will wish him health and eternity and so on and so forth. Therefore, the point remains that Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot is not about Arbuthnot at all. It is mostly an autobiographical poem about Pope. The only two things where Arbuthnot is important is that Arbuthnot advocates moderation for Pope, one. And secondly, he suggests that Arbuthnot has asked him to write oblique satires where he will not name his targets, but very obliquely he will sort of identify their faults and thereby critique them. Right. Now, it is therefore that I'm suggesting two things, and these are the two important directions in which I will move, is how does this poem create a picture of contemporary literary society in Britain? This is one of my thrust areas as I sort of discuss this poem with you. The second thrust area will be what sort of self-construction does Pope attempt in the Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, right? So these are two of the directions that I'm going to talk about as I discuss this poem. I will, of course, also remind you that because it's a 419 sort of line poem, we'll take up sections of the poem. I've already circulated an e-text to you, which has been edited by Jack Lynch, and I think it's a reasonably decent edition with its annotations. I've also talked to you about who Arbuthnot was, a figure of rationality, a figure of moderation, a figure of learning, a member of the Scriblerus Club, therefore attuned to literary genius. He was also the physician to Queen Anne and a very close friend of Pope. In fact, he said that the poem was the best memorial that I can leave, both of my friendship to you and of my own character being such as you need not be ashamed of that friendship. So once again, in keeping with the character of Arbuthnot, this poem has a very balanced and a very controlled, moderate tone, satirical tone. It is more philosophical, it is more autobiographical and intimate. And Pope wrote that this was written piecemeal, many years, and which I have now made haste to put together. Right? 1734 being the date when he learns that Arbuthnot is sick, and it appears in 1734, although it's January 1735 when it's published, and Arbuthnot dies 8 months after the poem has been published. Right. Now, so this is the introductory remarks before we launch into the text proper. There's one more thing that I need to talk to you about before I launch into a more detailed discussion. If the epistles were directed towards particular persons, how was Pope going to distinguish these epistles and say what were going to be the markers of human nature. Now, as you've seen from our lectures on the Enlightenment, human nature became the subject of numerous treatises of the period. And you can see how, human nature is seen as existing somewhere between the beast and the divine. So how was Pope going to distinguish these epistles? What were these epistles about, and how would human characteristics? Pope is creating a gallery of characters after all. So every character is unique in that sense of the term. So how was this to be uniquely made? And therefore, I am quoting from the Epistle to Cobham. And in Epistle to Cobham, Pope suggests that every character has a ruling passion. He says it only remains to find, if we can, his ruling passion. That will certainly influence all the rest and can reconcile the seeming or real inconsistency of all his actions. Examples of the strength of the ruling passion and its continuation to the last breath is what I trace. Therefore, to form characters, he says, we can only take the strongest actions of a man's life and try to make them agree. So, in every one of these characters, as you will see, Pope creates not him as a kind of a round kind of a character or a complete character. Pope creates a kind of a cross section of his personality, the ruling passion, and therefore makes him a unidimensional figure. Let me give you an example. For example, Atticus, when Addison is marked by literary envy, right? He does not want anybody to be greater than him. So literary envy is his ruling passion. And therefore the character is to be delineated, is to be determined by this ruling passion. For example, in the character of Buffo, we find that the ruling passion is pride, empty pride, right? And self-absorption and pride. Therefore, that is going to be the ruling passion. So when Pope is creating this gallery of characters, of satirical portraits, as it were, he's obliquely referring to them not merely also as individuals, but as these different passions of human nature, more like humorous characters in comedy. They are unidimensional. They have a certain degree of lack, a certain degree of deficiency. And by default, what is coming out is that between Arbuthnot and Pope, they lack these deficiencies. So they are the figures of complete and benevolent mankind, which is free of these ruling passions, as it were. If there is a ruling passion within Arbuthnot, that ruling passion is one of moderation, proper taste, proper ethics. And for Pope, the ruling passion of his life is creating poetry, writing poetry, and being in general a sort of keeper of the taste of the period. Therefore, once again, let me get back to this point. By delineating several characters with ruling passions and deficiencies, Pope is suggesting that within the literary world of the 18th century, he is the one who maintains taste, He's the one who's meant to write, and he is the one who becomes a surrogate figure of Horace in the 18th century. This poem is very craftily done. It has its autobiographical contents, but as you will remember, when you write autobiography, you present a version of the self. You don't write everything. You present only a very secluded, a very selected version of the self. So Pope's version of self-fashioning here is very crafty in the sense that he's creating himself as not only the dominant literary figure of the period, but also one who is most equipped to handle the ethical, moral, and literary values of the period. It is therefore that the figure of Pope will emerge through the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. And how this craft moves is something we shall take a look at. I propose that every session we will have approximately 100 lines discussed. So in our next discussion, we will take up the first 100 lines of the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. I will, of course, now stop the recording and allow your questions